Hey guys, it is Brooke, or the Undead DM, and I am back at it again with another video for you today. And in this episode, this very special episode, I'd like to say to start off, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays to anybody who would be watching this around the time that it is going to be released, which will be December 23rd. So, Happy Holidays, hope you all had a great or going to have a great Christmas, or if you're watching this afterwards, have a great Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, whatever it is you celebrate. But in this very special episode, I'm going to going over something that I think is very valuable for pretty much anybody, and it's that you need to know how I do all of my calculations, or how optimizers do a lot of their calculations when it comes to determining whether or not something is good and or bad. So, if you like this video, please leave a like, comment, subscribe if you want to see more. And with that, let's get right into it. So, how we create baselines, as you may have recalled from my previous video, is that we make charts to determine how much damage a character can do in a given round. And these are the calculations that we typically use for that. So here, right up here, we have the average damage die. So the average damage is basically how much damage you are going to be doing if you were to take the average of everything. So an example, just in case that a lot of people may have either missed that lesson in high school or middle school, wherever you learned it. How you get an average is you take all the numbers possible. You take every outcome, add them together, and then you divide that sum by the number of outcomes. So for instance, you would take a d6 and you would add 1 and 2 and 3, 4, 5, and 6. You'd add all those numbers together and then divide it by 6. That will give you the average roll of a d6, which in this case is 3.5. Yes, in the player's handbook, a d6 with a lot of weapons is listed as an average of 4, but that's because they don't deal in decimal points. So, if you want a more accurate representation as to what your damage is going to be like, then you need to use the percentage points. So it's very simple. It's very, very simple. I'll actually write it out for you here on the screen. So let's say you're dealing with a d4. Right? So a d4, you would think the average would be 3 because that's what it's told you. But it's actually 2.5 because you add, 4, 3, 2, and 1, you get 10. And if you divide 10 by 4, you get 2.5, naturally. So then you got a d6, and as I've already told you, a d6's average is 3.5. Not 3.52, sorry. And then you take the average of a d8, and it equals 4.5. So now we're going to have a little bit of a Dora the Explorer moment here. If a d4 is 2.5, a d6 is 3.5, and a d8 is 4.5, what do you think a d10 is? Give you about 5 seconds. That's right, 5.5. Very good. And then obviously the highest you can get in normal D&D is a d12, which is 6.5. So now I know some of you have questions like, well, Brooke, I got a question. Well, what happens if my weapon does multiple Ds of damage? So like, what happens if my great axe does 2d6 damage? Well, it's very simple. You just take the average of 2d6 and you add them together, and there's your average damage. So what's 3.5 plus 3.5? 7. Very simple. And then that's why if you look here in the average, it says die average if needed, because some damage some weapons use multiple damage dice. And then of course you add your modifier, but that's not your DPR. And that's just your average damage output, assuming you would hit 100% of the time. How you calculate DPR is you take your chance to hit, which varies based on certain attributes during the game. But typically, as a rough baseline, we use 65% chance to hit. It's a little above 50 because you're going to have modifiers that increase that. So we just use the average of 65%, or 0.65. So you multiply your average damage, so the average damage that we calculated previously, by 6.5, or 0.65, and you get the average damage per round. So let's take an example. So if you want, pull out your calculator, and we'll do this. Let's say you're a barbarian with a great axe. You have +3 strength, and you're using normal barbarian. So you have a +2 to your damage because you're raging. So what you would do then is you would take 7, because great axe is 2d6, or technically it's 1d12. So you take 6.5, so I apologize. You take 6.5, and then you would add your modifier. You would add your modifier. So if you're a barbarian, you would go and add +3 on average, because you're probably going to be using, these are all assuming that you're using point buy. So the maximum you can get out of point buy typically is 16 in a single stat. So it's typically assumed that you're going to have at least a +3 at level 1. So when you get that, you get 9.5. Now you can do this in two different ways. You can either put the 6.5 plus 3 in parentheses and then multiply it by your chance to hit, or you could add the two numbers together and then multiply it after the fact. Either way, it gives you the same result, whichever is easier for you to do at the time. So when you take that 9.5 that you now have, you can multiply it by 0.65, and you get your average damage per round of 6.175. Now, if you have multiple attacks, you essentially just take that DPR and multiply it by 2. So you take that 6.175 and you multiply it by 2 for 2 attacks. Your average is 12.35. If you get an ability score increase and you increase the primary stat by 1, you typically just do the same calculations, and if your weapon also has a bonus to it, like it's a +2 sword or a +2 axe, you add that to the bonuses as well. Now, where it gets complicated for it to hit is if you have things like sharpshooter or crossbow expert. That's where it gets interesting. So, if we think of it this way, the typical standard is that everybody has a 5% chance to crit. As in, you have a 5% chance every time you roll the d20 to roll a natural 20 and crit. So if we take that same logic, that means every number on a d20 is equal to 5%, or 0.05. So if your average chance to hit without any negatives and any positives is 65%, and you lower it, what do? I'll give you about a couple of seconds to figure it out. That's right, you subtract your chance to hit. So, because sharpshooter and crossbow expert make you subtract 5 to your hit, that means you just take 0.05, multiply it by 5, you get 0.25, or 25%. So, you just take 65%, subtract 25%, you get 40. But since you're adding to damage, and your chance to hit is lower now, you multiply your DPR, you multiply your average damage like normal, except you add 10 to the damage, and then you multiply it by your new chance to hit. So going back to the barbarian example, if you have your 6.5 axe, then you add your 3 to strength, then you add your 10 from Great Weapon Master, you get 19.5. But then you multiply it by 0.4, because your chance to hit is now lower. So now what you do is that if you use that with advantage, which we're going to go over here in a second, the 0.4 can actually go higher, and if you have certain other abilities that increase your chance to hit, so if you're a bow user with sharpshooter, and you also have the archery fighting style, which adds +2 to your attack roll, you essentially can take that -5 down to a -2, so you can actually make it closer to a 50% chance to hit instead of 40%, which gives you a slight damage increase. So, now what you do is your average chance to hit, your advantage chance to hit, I apologize, your advantage to hit. This means that if you have advantage on the attack roll, you take, this is the number you would use in place of your normal 0.65 hit bonus. So in the previous example, how I was stating that if you have sharpshooter and advantage somehow, because you're playing a rogue with steady aim, sharpshooter combo with crossbow expert, what you would do then is how I've personally done it, is I've done it at advantage first, and then did the subtraction. So your average chance to hit is 0.65. So your advantage chance to hit is 0.4 squared. Or sorry, this would be 0.35 squared. That is back before it was when I used. This is back when I used 60%, not 65% chance. So basically, take your chance to hit, your average chance to hit of 65, and then subtract it from 1, and you get your chance to miss. So with advantage, you take your chance to miss, which in this case is 35%, and then you square it. And then you take the squared amount and subtract it from 1, and that number that it spits out is now your advantage chance to hit. So then with that advantage, if you have a subtraction to your hit bonus, like you're using sharpshooter, I typically would do it at this point because the advantage, I would assume advantage applies before the hit. I could be wrong on that. I don't know if the calculations really change either way. That will definitely be something I will pin in the comments section at some point once I get more research on that. But typically, it's not going to come up a lot unless you're specifically building for that. But now we get to the crit. So I did skip over the crit DPR because the crit damage is affected by advantage. So as we all know, crits are 5%, like I said before. So what you do in order to add the potential to crit is you just take your average die. So if we go back to that axe example with a barbarian, your average crit your average crit DPR is now equal to that 6.175, and then you would take the 7 or the 6.5, and then you would multiply it by 0.05, and then whatever it spits out, which in this case is 0.325, you would then add that to the 6.175, and then that's your average damage if you were to crit. Because remember, all critting does in 5e rules as written is it just doubles the dice. So instead of rolling 1d6 and then just dealing double that damage, you roll 1d6 and then you roll an additional d6 and that's the crit. It's kind of boring, but in general, in most games, 99% of games, that's how DMs are going to rule it, as it is what is written in the rulebook. Now, crits with advantage, however, if we go back to that previous example, where now it is a higher chance to hit, your crit chance also increases. So because we take the average chance to miss, which is 0.35, and then we square it, that is 0.1225. So we take 0.1225, we subtract it from 1. The average to hit with advantage is 87 now. So now what we do, since we have an 87% chance to hit, your crit essentially gets squared. So you take 0.05 and then you square it, or sorry, you multiply it by 2, which should give you an average of 10%. And it usually is an additional, it is 10%. So now what you do is the same thing. So you take your die average, your modifier, or your average damage in this case, you multiply it by your advantage to hit, and then you take your average die and then multiply it by the higher number. And then you add that to the advantage damage, and that's how much you're dealing. So in general, that's how we calculate things. I know there's not a lot of spell math here, like, well, what happens on if you have a spell that has a save? Well, that's a lot more of a complicated situation, and I would honestly just recommend checking out the link I'm going to leave in the pinned comment section down below. And it is a link to a calculator that has a separate portion for that, because it has the chance that a creature will fail a saving throw, and how you would calculate that changes based on level, your attack modifier, your spell DC in relation to the creature's modifier to that, and if the spell even does have on a save. So it's a bit complicated, and even the people in the wonderful Pack Tactics server even recommend to just use this calculator or another similar calculator, because it's a lot easier to figure out. But in general, this is what you're going to be using if you're trying to figure out the DPR of your class, how it fares with crits, without crits. Obviously, if your crit chance increases in another way, your crit chance is going to keep getting higher. So if you're a champion fighter and you get an increased chance to crit, you're going to have a higher crit chance, obviously. So you're going to go from 10 to 15 with advantage, and then you're going to be going from 15 to 20 later on in levels. So you could get a pretty high crit chance, but if you heard from the previous example, then the average crit damage isn't that much. It's usually less than 1. It is maybe a tenth, a fifth, maybe even a quarter of 1. It is so minuscule that it's really not worth figuring out, since the damage increase is so low. But I digress. With that, I'd like to actually thank everybody for joining me in this first few months of my channel. It's been a crazy year, honestly. I never thought I would actually come back to my YouTube channel after years of being gone from it. You know, I made this channel back in 2013, still in middle school, uploading cringy Minecraft videos, and, you know, I never thought it would actually get to where it is now, where I'm talking about D&D on a channel that, you know, I've had for years, and have subscribers, and, you know, it's not a lot, but I am very grateful for all of you who have decided to watch this show enjoy looking at the math and the absurdity of some homebrews. But new things are coming. For New Year's, I actually have another special in mind for you guys. So for the New Year's special, I'm actually going to be going over something that's very near and dear to me. I'm going to be going over one of my own classes and kind of showing you all the comparisons between the the base version and the version that I use. So, be on the lookout for that. But with that being said, I'd like to thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have or had a very Merry Christmas, and I will see you all in the next video. Latest.